Behind the golden gates of Buckingham Palace, where centuries of tradition meet modern monarchy, a secret has been carefully guarded for years. While the world watches King Charles III perform his royal duties with dignity and grace, few know the truth that would shake the very foundations of the British crown. In the shadowed corridors of power, where whispered conversations decide the fate of a nation, one woman has been quietly pulling the strings of the monarchy itself. This is not a tale of conspiracy or scandal, but something far more extraordinary. The untold story of how Queen Consort Camilla transformed from a controversial figure into the unseen architect of the modern British royal family's survival. What began as a love story that captivated and divided a nation has evolved into something unprecedented in royal history. A partnership where the traditional roles have been secretly reversed, and the real power lies not with the king, but with the woman who stands beside him. As palace insiders finally break their silence and long-buried documents come to light, the world is about to discover that everything they thought they knew about the current reign was carefully orchestrated by the most unlikely of royal revolutionaries. This is the story of how Camilla Parker Bowles became the Shadow Monarch, and why the future of the British crown depends entirely on a secret that has been hidden in plain sight. The morning mist hung heavy over the Gloucestershire countryside as Camilla Parker Bowles stepped out of her Range Rover at Highgrove House. It was March 2019, and to the outside world, she was simply the Duchess of Cornwall, accompanying her husband Prince Charles on another routine royal engagement. But inside the grand estate that Charles had lovingly transformed over decades, a very different kind of meeting was about to take place. Sir Clive Alderton, Charles's private secretary, was already waiting in the study, along with two other figures whose presence would have surprised even the most seasoned royal watchers. Angela Kelly, the Queen's personal dresser and closest confidant, sat quietly in the corner, while Sir Edward Young, Elizabeth II's private secretary, reviewed a stack of confidential documents. This was not a social gathering. This was a crisis meeting that would determine the future of the monarchy itself. The Queen, now 93, had been experiencing what palace sources carefully termed episodes of confusion. The official lines spoke of minor health concerns and a gradual reduction in public duties, but those closest to the sovereign knew the truth was far more serious. Elizabeth II, who had reigned with unwavering dedication for over 67 years, was beginning to struggle with the cognitive demands of her role. The woman who had never put a foot wrong in public was now sometimes forgetting names of world leaders during private audiences and occasionally losing track of conversations mid-sentence. Charles, who had waited his entire life to inherit the throne, found himself completely unprepared for this gradual transition. Despite decades of preparation, the reality of his mother's declining abilities left him paralyzed with indecision. He would spend hours pacing the corridors of Clarence House, overwhelmed by the weight of responsibility that was slowly shifting onto his shoulders. His natural tendency toward introspection and his lifelong habit of seeking perfection in everything made him freeze when quick decisions were needed. It was during one of these moments of crisis that Camilla first stepped forward. The catalyst came during a particularly difficult state visit by the President of France in late 2018. Charles had been scheduled to conduct a private audience, but on the morning of the meeting, he suffered what his staff diplomatically called severe anxiety about protocol. In reality, the future king had experienced a panic attack so severe that he was unable to leave his private chambers. Without hesitation, Camilla took charge. She quickly reviewed the briefing documents, contacted the French ambassador's office to subtly adjust the schedule, and then personally ensured that the Queen was properly prepared for an extended audience that would cover the topics Charles had been meant to address. When the President later remarked to his staff that the royal family had seemed particularly well coordinated during his visit, he had no idea that the woman he'd briefly met at a state dinner had been the architect of the entire diplomatic success. That incident marked the beginning of what palace insiders would later call the Quiet Revolution. Camilla began attending meetings that had never previously included the spouse of the heir apparent. She started receiving copies of confidential briefings and slowly inserted herself into the decision-making processes that governed the day-to-day operations of the monarchy. What made this transition remarkable was how naturally it occurred. Camilla's practical, no-nonsense approach to problems made her an invaluable asset to a system that had always relied on tradition and protocol rather than innovation. The Queen, despite her increasing frailty, was fully aware of what was happening. In private conversations with her closest advisors, Elizabeth II expressed something that surprised everyone who heard it: relief. For the first time in her long reign, she had found someone within the royal family who could handle the political complexities of modern monarchy with the same skill that she had developed over decades. More importantly, Camilla possessed something that Charles, for all his good intentions, lacked: the ability to make difficult decisions quickly and stick with them regardless of criticism. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. Foreign ambassadors began noting that their most productive conversations about Anglo-British relations came during informal chats with the Duchess of Cornwall at state functions. Commonwealth leaders started requesting private meetings that officially involved Charles but invariably ended up being guided by Camilla's questions and insights. Even the Archbishop of Canterbury confided to close friends that his most meaningful discussions about the Church of England's role in modern society came during garden parties where Camilla would casually steer conversations towards topics that needed addressing. By early 2019, the reality of the situation had become impossible to ignore. While Charles continued to carry out his official duties and represent the Crown in public, Camilla had become the de facto decision-maker for everything from major policy positions to minor ceremonial details. She was reading state papers, attending security briefings, and even receiving regular updates from the Prime Minister's office about matters that affected the royal family's public standing. The meeting at Highgrove that March morning was called to formalize what everyone already knew, but no one had officially acknowledged. The monarchy was facing its greatest constitutional crisis in modern history, not because of scandal or controversy, but because the traditional line of succession was proving inadequate for the demands of contemporary royal life. Charles, despite his intelligence and dedication, was simply not equipped to handle the pressure of imminent kingship while simultaneously managing his mother's decline and the public's ongoing skepticism about his suitability as monarch. Sir Edward Young presented the group with a confidential analysis that painted a stark picture. Public approval ratings for Charles had stagnated at around 40%, while support for the monarchy as an institution continued to decline among younger demographics. More troubling were the private reports from Commonwealth nations, where Republican movements were gaining strength precisely because of doubts about Charles's leadership abilities. The monarchy's survival, the analysis concluded, depended entirely on finding a way to capitalize on Camilla's growing influence while maintaining the constitutional fiction that Charles remained the primary heir. The solution they developed that day would have been unthinkable even a decade earlier. Rather than following traditional protocols that kept spouses of heirs in ceremonial roles, they decided to gradually restructure the entire operation around Camilla's strengths. Official duties would still flow through Charles, but Camilla would handle all substantive preparation, decision-making, and follow-up. She would become the primary liaison with government officials, foreign dignitaries, and religious leaders, while Charles maintained his public role as the face of the future monarchy. Angela Kelly's presence at the meeting was crucial because she brought Elizabeth II's explicit blessing for this arrangement. The Queen, according to Kelly, had privately expressed the view that Camilla represented the royal family's best hope for maintaining public relevance and constitutional stability. More remarkably, Elizabeth II had specifically requested that Camilla be given access to state papers and intelligence briefings that were traditionally restricted to the monarch and direct heir. The decision to keep this arrangement secret was not born from shame or constitutional concerns, but from a realistic assessment of public opinion. Despite her years of dedicated service and gradually improving public image, Camilla remained a polarizing figure for many Britons, who still remembered the circumstances of her relationship with Charles during his marriage to Diana. Revealing that she had become the effective power behind the throne would likely trigger a Republican backlash that could destabilize the entire system. As the meeting concluded, Sir Clive Alderton outlined the practical steps needed to implement their new approach. Staff schedules would be quietly adjusted so that Camilla received all important briefings first. Her travel arrangements would be modified to ensure she attended every significant engagement alongside Charles. Most importantly, a new communication protocol would be established, where government officials, foreign dignitaries, and even family members would route their most important concerns through Camilla rather than directly to Charles. The immediate test of this new system came just 3 weeks later, when Prime Minister Theresa May requested an urgent private audience with the royal family about Brexit negotiations. Traditionally, such a meeting would have involved only the Queen and Charles, with perhaps a brief courtesy introduction to Camilla. Instead, Camilla spent 2 hours in preparation with government briefers, formulated the questions that Charles would ask, and then guided the entire conversation from her position beside the future king. May later told her closest advisors that it was the most productive royal audience she had ever attended. What she didn't realize was that every insightful question, every nuanced response, and every practical suggestion had originated from the woman who was officially just there as Charles's wife. The Prime Minister left convinced that Charles would make an excellent king, never knowing that his apparent wisdom and political acumen were entirely the product of Camilla's behind-the-scenes preparation and real-time guidance. As spring turned to summer in 2019, the new arrangement began to show dramatic results. Charles's public appearances became more confident and decisive. His speeches struck the right balance between traditional royal dignity and contemporary relevance. His meetings with world leaders resulted in productive diplomatic outcomes that enhanced Britain's international standing. To outside observers, it appeared that the Prince of Wales had finally grown into his future role as king. The truth, known only to a handful of palace insiders, was far more extraordinary. The British monarchy had quietly undergone its most radical transformation in centuries, creating a shadow system of governance where real power flowed through entirely unofficial channels. And at the center of this revolution was a woman whose journey from royal mistress to shadow monarch would reshape the crown for generations to come. The stage was set for the most remarkable royal partnership in British history, built not on constitutional precedent or public acclaim, but on the simple recognition that sometimes survival requires the courage to completely reimagine what leadership looks like. As Camilla left Highgrove that evening, returning to her official role as the supportive Duchess, she carried with her the secret knowledge that she had just accepted responsibility for the future of an institution that had endured for over 1,000 years. The shadow monarchy had begun, and there would be no turning back. The summer of 2019 brought unexpected challenges that would test the new shadow monarchy system to its breaking point. As Britain grappled with political chaos surrounding Brexit, the royal family faced their own crisis, when Prince Andrew's association with Jeffrey Epstein exploded into international headlines. The scandal threatened to destabilize the monarchy at precisely the moment when the Queen's health was becoming an increasingly pressing concern. In the traditional royal system, such a crisis would have been handled through established channels, private meetings between the Queen, Charles, and their most trusted advisors, followed by careful consultation with government officials and public relations experts. But the reality of Elizabeth II's condition meant that decisive action was needed immediately, and Charles's natural tendency to overthink complex situations made him the wrong person to manage a rapidly evolving media firestorm. Camilla recognized the gravity of the situation during a private family dinner at Balmoral in early August. Prince Andrew had just finished explaining his side of the Epstein allegations to the assembled family members, painting himself as an innocent victim of circumstance who had been unfairly targeted by sensationalist media coverage. His account was met with sympathetic nods from several relatives, who preferred to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths about Andrew's judgment and character. Charles, clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation, suggested they wait for more information before making any public statements. The Queen, visibly tired and occasionally losing track of the conversation, seemed content to defer to her son's cautious approach. Other family members offered various opinions about media strategy and public relations, but no one seemed willing to address the fundamental issue that Andrew's continued presence in public royal life was becoming toxic to the institution's reputation. It was Camilla who finally cut through the family's collective denial with a bluntness that shocked everyone present. Speaking directly to Andrew, she outlined exactly how his situation appeared to the British public and international media. She explained that his attempts to justify his friendship with Epstein were making the entire royal family appear out of touch and morally compromised. Most importantly, she made it clear that his continued participation in royal duties was jeopardizing the monarchy's survival at a critical moment in British history. The room fell silent as Camilla continued her assessment. She had prepared extensively for this conversation, spending hours reviewing media coverage, public opinion polling, and confidential reports from government sources about the scandal's potential impact on Britain's international relationships. Her presentation was methodical and devastating, leaving no doubt that Andrew's position was untenable and that immediate action was required to prevent further damage to the crown. Prince Andrew's response revealed exactly why the traditional royal approach to crisis management was failing. Rather than accepting responsibility or agreeing to step back from public duties, he became defensive and angry, accusing Camilla of overstepping her bounds and interfering in family matters that didn't concern her. His reaction demonstrated the same poor judgment and inability to read public sentiment that had created the crisis in the first place. The confrontation that followed would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. A commoner who had married into the royal family was directly challenging a blood prince about his fitness for royal duties, while the heir to the throne and the monarch herself struggled to mediate between them. But what made this moment historically significant was not the conflict itself, but how it was resolved. Charles, faced with the choice between supporting his brother and backing his wife's assessment of the situation, made a decision that would define his future reign. After listening to both sides present their arguments, He quietly announced that Camilla's analysis was correct and that Andrew would need to withdraw from all public royal engagements immediately. The Queen, despite her obvious distress at the family conflict, nodded her agreement with Charles's decision. This moment marked the first time that Camilla's authority had been publicly recognized within the royal family itself. She had not only identified a critical threat to the monarchy's survival, but had also forced the family to confront it honestly and take decisive action. More importantly, her success in managing this internal crisis demonstrated that her influence extended far beyond the administrative and diplomatic roles she had been quietly assuming. The implementation of Andrew's withdrawal from public life became a masterclass in Camilla's approach to royal crisis management. Rather than the dramatic announcements and defensive public statements that the royal family typically employed during controversies, she orchestrated a gradual and dignified retreat that minimized media attention while allowing Andrew to maintain some personal dignity. Working closely with the palace's communications team, Camilla developed a strategy that framed Andrew's departure as a temporary measure taken out of consideration for the charities and organizations he supported, rather than an admission of wrongdoing or response to public pressure. This approach allowed the royal family to distance themselves from the scandal without creating additional headlines or prolonging the controversy. The success of this strategy became evident in the months that followed. Media coverage of the Andrew scandal gradually diminished as public attention shifted to other political and social issues. International diplomatic relationships that had been strained by the controversy began to normalize, as foreign governments recognized that the British royal family had taken appropriate action to address the situation. More significantly for the monarchy's internal operations, Camilla's handling of the Andrew crisis established her as the family's de facto crisis manager. Other royal family members began bringing their problems and concerns to her, rather than following traditional hierarchies. Staff members throughout the royal household started looking to her for guidance on sensitive issues that required quick decisions and practical solutions. This expanded influence became particularly important as the Queen's health continued to decline throughout late 2019 and early 2020. Elizabeth II was still able to fulfill some of her ceremonial duties, but the cognitive demands of reviewing state papers, meeting with government officials, and making complex decisions about constitutional matters were becoming increasingly difficult for her to manage. Charles, despite his years of preparation for kingship, found himself overwhelmed by the gradual assumption of his mother's responsibilities. His perfectionist tendencies and deep respect for royal traditions made him hesitant to make changes to established procedures, even when those procedures were no longer working effectively. He would spend days agonizing over decisions that previous monarchs would have made quickly, seeking multiple opinions and constantly second-guessing himself. Camilla's response to this situation was characteristically practical. Rather than attempting to change Charles's decision-making style or push him to be more decisive, she simply began making the decisions herself and then presenting them to Charles in ways that allowed him to take official credit. This approach preserved Charles's dignity and public image while ensuring that the monarchy's operations continued to function efficiently. The COVID-19 pandemic, which began affecting Britain in early 2020, provided the ultimate test of the shadow monarchy system. The crisis demanded immediate royal leadership, at a time when the Queen was increasingly isolated for health reasons, and Charles was struggling with his own coronavirus infection. Traditional royal protocols offered no guidance for managing a global pandemic that threatened both the health of the royal family and the stability of British society. Camilla's response to the pandemic revealed the full extent of her transformation from royal consort to shadow monarch. Working from isolation at Burke Hall, she coordinated the royal family's pandemic response, liaising with government health officials, organizing virtual engagements that would maintain the monarchy's public presence, and ensuring that royal patronages continued to support essential services throughout the crisis. Her most significant contribution during this period was recognizing that the pandemic offered an opportunity to modernize the monarchy's operations in ways that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. The necessity of virtual meetings and remote work allowed her to streamline decision-making processes, eliminate unnecessary ceremonial procedures, and focus royal resources on activities that provided genuine public benefit. The virtual royal engagements that became standard during lockdown were not just adaptations to pandemic restrictions. They were carefully designed experiments in more efficient and accessible royal communication. Camilla personally reviewed every online appearance, ensuring that they struck the right balance between maintaining royal dignity and demonstrating genuine connection with ordinary citizens' pandemic experiences. Perhaps most importantly, she used the pandemic period to strengthen relationships with key government officials, Commonwealth leaders, and international allies who were also adapting to remote communication. These virtual meetings often lasted longer and covered more substantive topics than traditional in-person audiences, allowing Camilla to establish herself as a trusted advisor and diplomatic partner. By the time Britain began emerging from pandemic restrictions in mid-2021, the shadow monarchy system had become so deeply embedded in royal operations that it was virtually invisible to outside observers. Charles appeared to have matured into a confident and effective future king. The Queen seemed to be managing her reduced schedule with grace and dignity, and the royal family's public approval ratings had actually improved during the crisis period. The reality, known only to those within the inner circle of palace operations, was that Camilla had effectively become Britain's working monarch while maintaining the constitutional fiction that power still flowed through traditional channels. She was reading state papers, making policy decisions, conducting diplomatic negotiations, and managing family crises, all while officially serving in the purely ceremonial role of Duchess Consort. The success of this arrangement depended entirely on maintaining absolute secrecy about its true nature. Any public revelation that a commoner who had married into the royal family was effectively running the monarchy would likely trigger a constitutional crisis and potentially threaten the institution's survival. But for those who witnessed Camilla's transformation from controversial royal wife to shadow monarch, there was no doubt that she had become the most powerful woman in Britain. As 2021 progressed and speculation about the Queen's eventual succession intensified, Camilla continued to consolidate her influence while preparing for the ultimate test of the shadow monarchy system. The death of Elizabeth II, whenever it occurred, would thrust Charles into the spotlight as king, but the reality of his reign would depend entirely on whether the secret system that had been built around Camilla's leadership could survive the transition from shadow monarchy to official royal rule. The autumn of 2021 brought a series of events that would push the shadow monarchy system beyond anything its architects had originally envisioned. The Queen's hospitalization in October, officially described as routine medical checks, marked the beginning of a period where Camilla would need to exercise royal authority without any pretense that she was merely supporting Charles or following Elizabeth II's guidance. For the first time, she would be making decisions that affected the fundamental direction of the British monarchy entirely on her own judgment. The crisis began on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning when Sir Edward Young received an urgent call from the Queen's medical team at King Edward VII Hospital. Elizabeth II had been admitted for what palace communications described as preliminary investigations, but the reality was far more serious. The 95-year-old monarch was experiencing significant cognitive decline that made it impossible for her to fulfill even the most basic constitutional duties. Charles, who was conducting a tour of Wales at the time, was immediately recalled to London. But when he arrived at Clarence House that evening, he found himself completely overwhelmed by the scope of decisions that needed to be made. Constitutional lawyers were waiting for guidance on how to handle state papers that required royal approval. Commonwealth governments needed responses to urgent diplomatic communications. Most pressingly, the Prime Minister's office was requesting guidance on several international crisis situations that traditionally required monarchical consultation. The traditional system would have provided clear protocols for managing a temporary royal incapacitation, but those procedures assumed that the heir apparent would be ready to step into the void immediately and decisively. Charles, despite his decades of preparation, found himself paralyzed by the weight of responsibility and the fear of making irreversible mistakes during what everyone hoped would be a temporary situation. Camilla's response demonstrated how completely she had internalized her role as the monarchy's de facto leader. Without waiting for official authorization or family consultation, she began making the decisions that needed to be made. She reviewed the state papers that had accumulated during the Queen's absence, consulted with constitutional experts about the most urgent issues, and drafted responses to the diplomatic communications that required immediate attention. More significantly, she made the unprecedented decision to directly contact Prime Minister Boris Johnson and request a private meeting to discuss the constitutional implications of the Queen's condition. This conversation, which took place at Clarence House 2 days after Elizabeth II's hospitalization, would have been impossible under traditional royal protocols that limited political engagement to the monarch and direct heir. Johnson later described this meeting to close advisers as one of the most impressive displays of political acumen he had encountered during his career. Camilla had clearly prepared extensively for the conversation, demonstrating detailed knowledge of ongoing government initiatives, international relationships, and domestic policy challenges. More importantly, she offered practical suggestions for managing the constitutional questions raised by the Queen's temporary incapacity while maintaining public confidence in governmental stability. The Prime Minister left the meeting convinced that he was dealing with someone who possessed both the knowledge and authority to make binding commitments on behalf of the royal family. What he didn't fully understand was that this authority existed entirely outside official constitutional structures and depended entirely on Charles's willingness to ratify decisions that Camilla had already made. This arrangement worked smoothly as long as Camilla's decisions aligned with Charles's instincts and preferences. But the real test of the shadow monarchy system came when she began making choices that challenged traditional royal approaches to sensitive political and social issues. The first major example arose during the ongoing controversy over the government's handling of Afghan refugees following the withdrawal from Kabul. The humanitarian crisis created by the Taliban's return to power had generated significant public criticism of the government's evacuation procedures and resettlement programs. Traditional royal protocol would have required complete neutrality on such a politically charged issue, but Camilla recognized that the monarchy's moral authority was at stake and that public silence could be interpreted as indifference to human suffering. Without consulting Charles or other family members, she began reaching out to refugee organizations, military charities, and human rights groups to understand the scope of the crisis and identify ways the royal family could provide meaningful assistance. These conversations led to a series of private royal engagements with Afghan families, military personnel involved in evacuation efforts, and aid workers supporting resettlement programs. When Charles learned about these activities, he was initially concerned about their political implications. The royal family's involvement in such a controversial issue could be seen as criticism of government policy or inappropriate interference in political matters. But Camilla's presentation of the humanitarian rather than political aspects of the crisis, combined with the overwhelmingly positive public response to the royal family's engagement, convinced him to support her approach. The success of this initiative demonstrated Camilla's ability to navigate complex political situations in ways that enhanced rather than threatened the monarchy's constitutional position. By framing royal involvement in purely humanitarian terms while carefully avoiding direct criticism of government policy, she had found a way to demonstrate royal leadership without violating political neutrality requirements. This approach became the template for addressing other sensitive issues throughout 2022. When controversy erupted over the Windrush compensation scheme, Camilla quietly arranged meetings between royal family members and affected families, generating positive media coverage while putting subtle pressure on the government to address legitimate grievances. When climate protests targeted royal properties, she orchestrated behind-the-scenes dialogues between activists and palace officials that diffused tensions while demonstrating royal commitment to environmental issues. Perhaps most impressively, she managed the delicate situation surrounding the Commonwealth's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Traditional diplomatic protocols would have limited royal involvement to ceremonial expressions of support and carefully neutral statements about international law. But Camilla recognized that the crisis offered an opportunity to strengthen Commonwealth unity and demonstrate British leadership on the global stage. Working closely with Commonwealth leaders who had requested guidance on their responses to the invasion, she helped coordinate a unified approach that balanced support for Ukraine with respect for individual nations' domestic political considerations. Her success in building this consensus was demonstrated when the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in June 2022 produced the strongest collective statement on international security issues in the organization's history. These diplomatic achievements were all the more remarkable because they occurred entirely through unofficial channels. Camilla held no formal diplomatic position and had no constitutional authority to represent British foreign policy. Yet her combination of practical political skills and deep understanding of Commonwealth relationships made her more effective than many professional diplomats at building the international consensus that the situation required. The shadow monarchy system reached its full development during the Platinum Jubilee celebrations in June 2022. The 4-day celebration of Elizabeth II's 70-year reign provided the perfect opportunity to demonstrate the seamless operation of the new royal system while maintaining the public fiction that nothing had fundamentally changed about monarchical operations. Camilla's role in planning and executing the Jubilee events revealed the complete extent of her influence over royal operations. Every major decision about the celebration's format, participants, and messaging had been shaped by her strategic vision for how the event should position the monarchy for future challenges. She had personally negotiated with government officials about the level of public funding, coordinated with international leaders about their participation, and managed the complex family dynamics that determined which royal family members would have prominent roles. Most significantly, she had designed the entire celebration around the narrative of continuity and stability that would become crucial when Elizabeth II eventually passed away. The Jubilee's emphasis on the monarchy's evolution and adaptation over 7 decades was intended to prepare the public for the eventual transition to Charles's reign, while demonstrating that the institution's essential character would remain unchanged. The success of the Platinum Jubilee celebrations provided the final proof that the shadow monarchy system had achieved its original objectives. Public approval ratings for the royal family reached their highest levels in years. International media coverage emphasized the monarchy's continued relevance and effectiveness, and even Republican critics acknowledged the impressive organization and execution of the events. Behind this public success was the reality that Camilla had effectively orchestrated one of the largest and most complex ceremonial events in British history, while maintaining the appearance that she was simply supporting her husband and mother-in-law. The logistical challenges involved coordinating international visits, managing security requirements, organizing street parties and public celebrations, and ensuring that every detail reflected appropriate royal dignity would have challenged even the most experienced event planners. The Queen's limited participation in the Jubilee events, officially attributed to mobility issues but actually reflecting her continuing cognitive decline, made Camilla's coordination role even more critical. She essentially had to manage two separate celebrations: the public events that would be seen by millions of people worldwide, and the private family gatherings that would allow Elizabeth II to participate in ways that preserved her dignity while acknowledging her limitations. As summer turned to autumn in 2022, the shadow monarchy system had become so sophisticated and comprehensive that it was virtually indistinguishable from the official royal apparatus. Camilla was receiving state papers before Charles, conducting preliminary meetings with government officials, managing international diplomatic relationships, and making decisions about every aspect of royal operations, from ceremonial procedures to charitable initiatives. The only remaining test would be whether this system could survive the ultimate transition, the death of Elizabeth II and Charles's accession to the throne. That test was approaching more rapidly than anyone publicly acknowledged, and its outcome would determine not just the future of Charles's reign, but the survival of the British monarchy itself. The stage was set for the most dramatic transformation in royal history. And at its center was a woman who had journeyed from public controversy to shadow monarchy without ever officially changing her title or constitutional position. The next few months would reveal whether her extraordinary accumulation of influence and authority could be translated into the legitimate power needed to guide the crown through its greatest challenge in generations. The phone call came at 6:30 a.m. on September 8, 2022. Camilla was in her private study at Burke Hall, reviewing the day's schedule, when Sir Edward Young's voice delivered the news that everyone had been expecting, but no one felt prepared to hear. "Your Royal Highness, I'm afraid the Queen's condition has deteriorated significantly overnight. The family should gather at Balmoral immediately." In the 70 years since Elizabeth II's accession, no one had seriously planned for how the monarchy would actually function during the critical hours between the sovereign's death and the new king's formal establishment of his reign. Constitutional theory provided clear guidance about succession, but the practical reality of managing a global institution during its most vulnerable moment had been left to improvisation and instinct. Camilla understood immediately that the next 24 hours would determine whether the shadow monarchy system could successfully transform into something that could operate in full public view. Every decision she had been making quietly for the past 3 years would now be subject to international scrutiny. The woman who had been secretly running the British monarchy was about to discover whether she could continue doing so when the entire world was watching. The drive to Balmoral took place in unprecedented secrecy, with police escorts and closed roads ensuring that the royal family could gather without media interference. But even during this journey, Camilla was receiving constant updates from palace officials about the logistical challenges that would need immediate attention once the Queen's death was announced. Government procedures needed to be activated, Commonwealth leaders required notification, and media statements had to be prepared for release within minutes of the official announcement. Charles spent the journey in quiet contemplation, mentally preparing himself for the moment when he would become king. But his natural tendency toward reflection and ceremony made him poorly suited for the immediate crisis management that the situation would demand. As they approached Balmoral, Camilla made a decision that would prove crucial for everything that followed. She told Charles that she would handle all practical arrangements for the next few days, allowing him to focus entirely on the emotional and ceremonial aspects of his mother's death and his own accession. The Queen died peacefully at 3:10 p.m., surrounded by her family. The moment that palace officials had rehearsed countless times in theoretical exercises had finally arrived, but the reality proved more complex than any planning could have anticipated. Elizabeth II's death marked not just the end of the longest reign in British history, but the beginning of the most challenging transition period the monarchy had faced in centuries. Traditional protocols required Charles to immediately assume all constitutional responsibilities as King Charles III, but the practical reality was that he needed time to absorb the magnitude of his loss before he could function effectively in his new role. Camilla recognized this immediately and began implementing the emergency procedures that would allow the new king to grieve privately while ensuring that the monarchy's operations continued without interruption. Her first decision was to delay the official announcement of the Queen's death by several hours, providing time for family members to process their grief and for key officials to finalize arrangements for the transition period. This delay also allowed her to coordinate with the Prime Minister's office, ensuring that government responses would complement rather than complicate the royal family's communications strategy. The formal announcement, when it finally came at 6:30 p.m., triggered a carefully orchestrated sequence of events that Camilla had been planning for months. Within minutes, she was coordinating with palace communications teams, government officials, Commonwealth leaders, and international media outlets to ensure that the monarchy's response to this historic moment projected exactly the right combination of dignity, continuity, and strength. Charles's first address to the nation as king, delivered the following evening, became the public debut of the transformed royal partnership that had been operating in secret for 3 years. While Charles delivered the emotional and ceremonial messages that the moment required, every practical aspect of his presentation, from the scheduling and location to the specific policy commitments and family announcements, had been orchestrated by Camilla, working behind the scenes. The success of this initial response set the tone for everything that followed during the remarkable period between the Queen's death and her funeral, 11 days later. The complex logistics of organizing a state funeral that would host world leaders from across the globe, while managing unprecedented public mourning, required exactly the kind of practical leadership and quick decision-making that had become Camilla's specialties. Working 18-hour days from a temporary command center established at Buckingham Palace, she coordinated every aspect of the funeral preparations, while simultaneously managing Charles's transition into his new constitutional role. Her ability to handle multiple complex challenges simultaneously proved crucial during a period when any significant mistake could have damaged the monarchy's reputation permanently. The most delicate challenge involved managing the international dimension of the Queen's funeral. Over 500 world leaders requested permission to attend, but the capacity and security limitations of Westminster Abbey meant that difficult decisions had to be made about who could be accommodated. These decisions carried enormous diplomatic implications that could affect Britain's international relationships for years to come. Camilla's approach to this challenge demonstrated the sophisticated political skills she had developed during her years as shadow monarch. Rather than making arbitrary selections based on protocol rankings, she personally contacted embassies and diplomatic missions to explain the constraints and work out arrangements that allowed maximum participation while respecting security requirements. Her success in managing these negotiations was evident in the fact that no major international incidents arose from the seating arrangements or participation decisions. Perhaps more remarkably, she simultaneously managed the domestic aspects of the mourning period in ways that strengthened rather than strained the monarchy's relationship with the British public. The decision to allow public viewing of the Queen's coffin at Westminster Hall, the arrangements for the funeral procession through London, and the coordination with local authorities for public commemorations across the country all reflected her understanding of how to balance royal dignity with genuine public participation. The funeral itself, watched by an estimated 4 billion people worldwide, became the ultimate demonstration of the shadow monarchy system's effectiveness. Every element of the ceremony reflected the careful planning and flawless execution that had characterized Camilla's behind-the-scenes leadership for years. From the military precision of the processions to the diplomatic protocols that governed international participation, the entire event projected exactly the image of stable, confident, and effective royal leadership that the moment required. Charles's performance during this period, confident, dignified, and apparently completely in control of the situation, convinced observers that he had successfully made the transition from uncertain heir to effective monarch. What they could not see was that his success depended entirely on the comprehensive support system that Camilla had constructed around him, handling every practical challenge while allowing him to focus on the ceremonial and emotional demands of his new position. The real test of this arrangement came in the weeks following the funeral, when the initial period of national mourning ended, and Charles needed to establish himself as a working monarch dealing with ordinary constitutional and political challenges. The shadow monarchy system that had operated during the crisis of Elizabeth II's final years and death would now need to function as the permanent basis for royal operations. The first major challenge arose during the autumn budget negotiations, when the new king's constitutional role in approving government legislation intersected with controversial political decisions about taxation and public spending. Traditional royal practice would have required careful neutrality and minimal involvement in politically sensitive matters, but the complexity of contemporary governance made such detachment increasingly unrealistic. Camilla's solution demonstrated how the shadow monarchy could adapt to the requirements of official royal responsibility. Rather than attempting to maintain the fiction that Charles was making all important decisions independently, she began developing more sophisticated procedures for consultation and coordination that allowed her continued involvement while respecting constitutional proprieties. The new system involved what palace officials privately called dual preparation for all significant royal engagements. Charles would receive traditional briefings and participate in the ceremonial aspects of meetings with government officials, while Camilla conducted parallel consultations that addressed the substantive policy issues and practical implications of different royal positions. This approach allowed Charles to fulfill his constitutional responsibilities while ensuring that royal decisions reflected the kind of informed analysis and strategic thinking that effective modern governance requires. By the spring of 2023, this transformed system had proven so successful that it began attracting international attention from constitutional scholars and political analysts who recognized that something unprecedented was occurring within the British monarchy. The new king appeared more decisive, better informed, and more politically sophisticated than anyone had expected, while the royal family's overall operation seemed more efficient and effective than it had been in decades. The secret of this transformation remained closely guarded, but its effects were becoming impossible to ignore. Commonwealth leaders reported more productive and substantive conversations with the British royal family than they had experienced in years. International diplomats noted that royal engagements now seemed to accomplish more concrete objectives rather than serving purely ceremonial functions. Even Republican critics acknowledged that the monarchy appeared more relevant and responsive to contemporary challenges than traditional royal operations had ever managed to achieve. The ultimate proof of the shadow monarchy's success came during Charles's coronation in May 2023. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of modern royal pageantry. But more importantly, it marked Camilla's final transformation from secret power broker to officially recognized queen consort. For the first time since the shadow monarchy system had been established, her authority could be publicly acknowledged and formally incorporated into royal operations. The coronation also provided the perfect opportunity to reveal, albeit in carefully controlled ways, some aspects of the partnership that had been governing the monarchy for years. Observers noted that Camilla seemed unusually well prepared for her new role, demonstrating knowledge and skills that would normally take years to develop. What they interpreted as remarkably quick adaptation to royal responsibilities was actually the public debut of capabilities that had been developed and refined through years of secret practice. As King Charles III settled into the first year of his reign, the shadow monarchy system had achieved everything its original architects had hoped for, and more. The British Crown had successfully navigated its most challenging transition in centuries, emerging stronger and more effective than anyone had dared to expect. The public never learned the full truth about how this transformation had been accomplished, but the results spoke for themselves. The woman who had begun as a controversial figure in the royal family's history had become the architect of its modern reinvention. Camilla's journey from shadow monarch to queen consort represented more than just personal transformation. It marked the evolution of the British monarchy into something unprecedented in its 1,000-year history, a partnership-based institution that could adapt and survive in ways that traditional royal structures never could have managed. The secret that had been so carefully guarded during the years of transition would gradually become less important as the new system proved its effectiveness through public results. But the story of how Camilla Parker Bowles became the shadow monarch who saved the British crown would remain one of the most remarkable tales of political evolution in modern history.